All right, well, I've got one after, so we will go ahead and get started. We'll have a full hour for y'all this afternoon. Thanks everybody for hopping on for hopefully a good conversation about shaping the future of social work supervision in Michigan. As many of you know, we have been talking about and working on looking at licensing issues that we have in Michigan, and part of that is looking at all of our standards and how we have in Michigan compare across our other jurisdictions in the United States. So we're very excited to have Jordan Freeman, our workforce program manager, here today to give you all a bit of an update about what's going on nationally, what are some of the conversations that we've been having internally here in Michigan, some of the results from our survey we did earlier this year, and hopefully to get some of your all's input on what might be the future of supervision here in Michigan. Before we get kind of formal into our agenda, I did want to drop a couple of resources in the chat. The first actually came to me this morning. Since this meeting is technically part of our workforce and working conditions group, if this is your first time joining us for one of those, we are glad to have you. Our internal group has been working for several years now on a couple of key initiatives around salary, working conditions, and supervision. We will have some really exciting movement this fall. We hope to have a survey out to our larger social work population on salaries later this fall. And we've started to do our work on supervision. But just today, the Michigan Health Council put out their Healthcare Workforce Index, which is a kind of a repository of data from the last year on healthcare rankings and kind of looking at where shortage areas exist, where there are differences in salaries, all that sort of stuff. And so that just came out today. Haven't had a deep dive in that, but I highly encourage folks to take a look at that when you have a moment. The second resources that I'm going to drop into the chat as we're going to focus on supervision this afternoon is our national standards for social work supervision. So this is a collaborative resource that was put together through our national organizations, not just NASW, but CSWE and ASWB. And that's kind of gives us a framework for how we're going to talk about social work supervision in today's session. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jordan to get us kicked off. And again, appreciate you all being here. For CE purposes, we will drop the link for your continuing education evaluation at the end of our hour today. So please make sure you stick around to get that. We'll probably drop that in about 5 minutes before the end of our session time.
Awesome. Thank you, Dwayne. I'm excited to have this conversation today. I know we have been talking about supervision in our workforce committee for a while, at least for my entire time with NASW. But it's exciting to see so many folks come today to talk about it together. Dwayne, I know, is going to kind of pop in and out as well. So let's see. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, which no matter how many times I do it is always like a big success for me if I pull it off correctly. All right. Hopefully so far so good.
Looks good.
Woo, yay, here we go. All right, so as Dwayne introduced me, I am the workforce program coordinator with NASW Michigan. I've been part of the team since last February, I think. I've been doing a lot of work on licensure. And then this year of our grant has been a little bit more focused on supervision. As you know, we're going to talk about it, but there's a lot of pieces of licensure, and supervision is a big part. So let's see. There we go. So introductions. I also, in case this is the first time you're virtually meeting me, I'm a clinically licensed social worker. I have a private practice where I see folks telehealth, and I'm course supervision trained. So I also offer supervision. So this is a conversation where I feel like both of my hats get to kind of stay on, which is kind of fun. So we're going to talk about types of supervision. We're going to acknowledge the ways that supervision is really part of our code of ethics. We're going to just quickly review current requirements in Michigan for licensure, as we're really acknowledging that supervision is a lifelong career. part of being a social worker, but we are kind of focusing down on our licensure supervision. Briefly, I'm going to share some of my information gathering I've done related to how other states handle training requirements for supervisors. And then I'm going to share some of the results from our survey. And then hopefully most of our conversation is going to be more open discussion. I want to hear from you all about what you think is important, what your experiences have been, and then any feedback from what we gathered in our survey. And then ultimately, hopefully, get everybody excited. Like, what's next? What do we do with this now that we're starting to continue to massage like what we should do? All right. So types of supervision. I kind of already mentioned this, but there is, I think we're a unique profession that we do really value it for your whole career. That doesn't necessarily mean having a supervisor that you pay to meet with once a month or once a week for the rest of eternity, but having some type of peer or colleague mentorship throughout your career. We know that helps with burnout. We know that is a really big part of how we, whether we're clinical or macro social workers, ensure that folks are getting good care and good services. I think that I know another project that I'm working on is related to ethical violations that we're looking at. And I think just, thinking about all of the opportunities that people have for sometimes making mistakes or getting, into bad situations often come from a lack of supervision, a lack of support, being isolated. So licensure supervision, which is largely what we're going to talk about, right? Like, we believe that those first couple of years after you finish your degree, you should have more than just this idea that you should be seeking supervision, like we think for our whole career. This should be more structured, and it should hopefully be a way for folks to really learn how to be a social worker and how to navigate not just day-to-day work, but also the licensure process. And then it's important to acknowledge too that, maybe our first not maybe, our first experience with supervision is when we're interns, right? Uniquely, social workers do a lot of internships, right? I mean, I know I got my bachelor's before I got my master's, so I had a bachelor's level internship and then I had a master's level internship. I still think about those supervisors that I had in those those workplace experiences, right? And I don't want to say it can make you or break you, but it can definitely have an impact. And I think most supervisors who are taking interns are really wanting to do a good job. And, sometimes it can be hard to balance providing any of these types of supervision, right? And so they're the same. They're like a is that a Venn diagram, right? Like, so many things would be in the middle of all the circles, but there are some things that make these types of supervisions different. Oops. All right. Code of ethics, right? I kind of already mentioned that we're going to talk about how supervision relates to our code of ethics. Firstly, I think having supervision leads to our competence, right? We know that it's an ethical principle for us that we work within our competence and that we continue to develop and enhance the profession. And so I think I would argue that having good supervision does that, right? That's a part of competence.
Jordan, on this slide, thinking about how competence intersects with supervision as well. So kind of where I'm going to come into Jordan's presentation a little bit today is to talk through where we get ethical concerns or where we see ethical questions, consultations, or potentially violations come in Michigan. And so there are really two pieces around this ethical value of competence that stick out in my mind as fairly regular occurrences that shouldn't be happening. The first is practicing outside of our competence or scope of practice. We get this comment or question pretty regularly. I'd say at least maybe once a month to our office, which we know then that's happening more than that. This happens a lot at the bachelor's level and sometimes at the macro level, more so than at our clinical space, where folks are getting asked to do usually clinical work, whether that's run psychotherapy sessions or groups. And that ultimately is really important to have competent, qualified supervisors to know when to not ask people to be doing things that are outside of their arena. And if we're in a host setting that is maybe not overseen by social workers, or we're working in interdisciplinary teams, supervision is really important to help navigate those questions when you might be getting pressure from an administration or higher up in an organization be doing something that's not within our purview as a profession. Interns sometimes fall into this category too, right? Interns are not staff. Interns are student learners. And so sometimes there is a scope violation or some gray area that organizations have in terms of what they have their students do. We get a lot of questions around billing and on the clinical side, can we have students run this sort of service or this sort of service? And really thinking through that in supervision, what's the competence of the student, right? What skills do they already have or not have, right? That we're asking them to be in place coming into this role. The second kind of major thing that we see every year is around 10% of all licensed social workers get audited by the state of Michigan, by LARA, the Licensing and Regulatory Affairs Office. And that is to determine if folks are meeting their minimal continuing education requirements. So in Michigan, we have 45 hours of CEs that are required. Y'all are earning one of those today, ethics. And of those 45, 5 have to be ethics, 2 have to be pain management, 2 human trafficking, and 2 additional training hours in implicit bias. So it's a little bit complex and it's not consistent state to state. So knowing what our requirements are is really important for especially those who are doing licensing supervision to be able to talk to and educate their future fully licensed LLs on before they transition into that period. But we see through those audits about 10% of the folks who get audited are not earning their continuing education or don't have documentation for their continuing education. So again, the CEs for today, you'll get an evaluation link to get download your certificate. But how you're tracking our own individual continuing education isn't formalized. There's no one-stop shop that you can use that's the state requires that you have to upload your CEs on a yearly basis. That's on us individually as licensed practitioners to determine what works best. NASW has a tracking service. LARA does have a tracking service. Some people just use Google. It's CE Broker is another one as well that the state uses. So there are platforms that can assist with that, but we do find quite a large number of social workers who aren't earning their minimal continuing education requirements. And that comes at a whole host of reasons. Sometimes that is confusion about what is acceptable continuing education, and supervision can play a really important role. I think this should be a regular part of how you're talking to your, especially if you're doing peer consultation or if you're an agency supervisor supervising staff. How are you talking about with your staff about, hey, are you up to date on your requirements? When is your renewal date? Let's look at what you've got completed and make sure you're on track to hit your marks, right? I don't think generally those conversations are happening as often as they should and as regularly as they should as a profession. And that's one area that I think is really easy for us to fix because there are hundreds of continuing education courses that are offered in Michigan. We have our schools of social work that are putting out great content. We have many of our organizations who are doing in-house or external continuing education opportunities. And in Michigan, you can earn all of your CEs now virtually. And so that has opened up the arena to what people can take and how they can take our education requirements. But as it relates to competent, that's definitely an area that we've seen continual, I'd say, areas for improvement.
Yeah, thanks, Dwayne. So then the second area that we often see supervision show up in our code of ethics is this number 2, right? 2.05 actually, consultation. So under the social worker's ethical responsibility to colleagues, social workers should seek advice and counsel whenever it's in the best interest of clients. Social workers should keep themselves self-informed about colleagues' areas of expertise and competencies, right? So, you know, for example, I've been doing some macro work. I worked in the hospital. I shouldn't be giving supervision necessarily to someone who's working in foster care, right? Not that I'm not a great supervisor. Maybe I think whatever. Like I should know what my areas of expertise are, and also in I should know the area of expertise of the social workers that I'm going to for consultation too, right? I am thinking of a few of my go-to social workers who I've worked with over the years that I do send a text message if there's something going on with a clinical client and I'm just like not sure, but um, it's up to us to navigate that, right? And to make sure that we're giving advice that is under our scope and also seeking it under folks who have those expertise. And then of course, just because we're consulting with a supervisor, or whether that's a formal licensure supervision or career-long supervision, it's not like a gossip session, right? It's giving the information that is needed to get some feedback and some support, but not breaking any client confidentiality or anything like that, just as an excuse. I think that's one of the ones that if we're starting to do that, perhaps we're a little burnt out, or we're needing a good supervisor, a good colleague to say, hey, I don't think I need to know their date of birth or what, whatever it is. Dwayne, did you have an example with this one too?
Yeah, in Michigan, the only thing we require in terms of licensing supervision is that the supervisor has a full license and that the designation match up. So if somebody's a clinically going towards their clinical license, that their supervisor has a full clinical license, macro. But really outside of that, there's no designated parameters like Jordan is saying that clinical means 1,000 things, right? Macro means 1,000 things. As a supervisor, you should at least have some competency in the area that your supervisee is going into. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to assist them, especially if you're a supervisor who's in if you're not working directly at site with that person, because you're not going to maybe understand the agency culture, some of the inner dynamics, some of the agency policy stuff. You're going to work through that in supervision, but you really want to make sure that you at least have as good of alignment as possible with your supervisees. The other piece that I think is becoming more and more challenging is the growth of social media and online platforms for social workers to communicate with. It's good and bad, right? We have My NASW through our own association, which is our virtual platform where people can ask questions, share resources through NASW. There's tons of Michigan-based Facebook groups, there's LinkedIn groups, there's Discord channels. But I do see sometimes some slippage in terms of our ethical responsibility to clients, particularly, and how are we not disclosing information? And I think in social media, sometimes when folks are asking for a peer consultation, looking for a referral or resources, they want to put enough information out to make sure the person is getting the best referral or information needed. But sometimes it does cross the line, and you'll see a lot of social workers will come into the chat and be like, hey, you shouldn't say this thing, or you should go back and edit and remove some identifying information that you might have put in about a client. And so we have to be very careful about what we are doing in virtual spaces, because A lot of those are public or can be screenshotted, and making sure that you are extra cautious about, yeah, Lori, there's way too much being shared on Facebook groups. Absolutely. Be very cautious about what you're sharing. Those groups are wonderful for resource sharing and connecting people, and can be a space to do some peer consultation, but we also want to make sure that there are I wouldn't say offline, but different professional spaces set up that are more guarded. Yes, Ruth uses Signal with her licensees. You can see the messages, and it self-destructs after a certain period of time. Danielle mentioned around social media and Facebook. It's very frightening. It's one of the reasons I was so drawn to this topic. Yes, yeah. We have to be very cautious about how social media interjects in a lot of our work, right? And how AI is now coming in, and you may post a comment and then it's going to create some new algorithm that may or may not have accurate information based off of that. And you can't always trust that the folks in those social media groups are licensed professionals, right? It's really hard as moderators to make sure that the people you think are right for that group are the ones who are actually getting in. And so we all have a job to kind of watch and monitor those. And if we see something, to say something, that's also a part of our code of ethics, to make sure our responsibility to colleagues is that we're touching base with people if we're sensing that there's some misinformation being put out there, or too much information. So that's just some of my thoughts around this particular one. I think we also just need to be very, as we talk about our relationships with colleagues, one of the things we see in ethics complaints filed to the state is the large majority of ethical violations have a either direct or an indirect supervision tie. And usually people who find themselves in a state-sanctioned ethical violation are isolated in their job. They don't have regular peer consultation or formal supervision, or they got incorrect information from usually a supervisor. Social work, half our title is social, but that doesn't always mean our jobs are surrounded by other mental health professionals, especially fellow social workers. And so seeking out that peer consultation or formal supervision can be really important, especially if you find yourself isolated, or if you're in private practice, or you're in an agency setting where there's not other professionals around. It's really critical that we have support to be able to pop ideas off of, to share, hey, I'm having this issue with a client, or this policy. We're seeing a lot of policy things happen at the state and federal level that are shifting access to client services, funding streams, how our agencies are staffed, right? And that's creating a lot of additional ethical questions around how we practice and who we practice with, or who we can practice with. And so finding your network of people locally and statewide is really important. And I think for folks doing supervision, whether that's intern supervision or licensing supervision in a formal way, how are you helping build out the networks for your students and your LLs? Because that is a really critical function of supervisors in my mind, is helping folks expand their resources, so when they have future issues come up, they have spaces to go to. So great question, Ken. What ramifications are there for supervisors who give out erroneous information to those that they supervise? Jordan, you want me to hold off on that question? Yeah, let's hold off.
Yeah, let's try to get to the end, and then we'll kind of tackle all the questions, although I'm so excited that people are already having thoughts. I want to make sure we have time. So this last ethical code of ethics element is related to number 3, ethical responsibilities in practice settings, right? It's right there, supervision and consultation. So this is similar to our last one, right? And I think, Dwayne made a lot of really good examples of this. So I don't know that we need to spend too much time here. But I think this one does add the elements that social workers who provide supervision are responsible for setting clear, appropriate, and culturally sensitive boundaries, right? It talks about not engaging in dual relationships. I think that's a really good point. And it talks about social media as well, but kind of in a different way. It acknowledges that being a supervisor is a different relationship than peers or friends or colleagues or whatever. And that oftentimes it's important to be mindful of that, not necessarily the same as with clients, but in its own way. And then I really like the last point of social workers who provide supervision should evaluate supervisees' performance in a manner that is fair and respectful, right? I think I would hope anybody who's a social worker, who's trained as a social worker, is going to do that, right? We are a strengths-based, solutions-focused profession often, and that's how we should be, in my opinion, that's how we should be supervising folks. And so just keeping that in mind. Well, this isn't, as we mentioned, Michigan doesn't have any training requirements for supervisors, but this is kind of our, this is what we should be coming off of, right? Working off of. Did you have anything to add on this one, Dwayne?
Yeah, I mean, I think this last bullet around how do we evaluate when we're doing supervision? It's one, a concern we see also pretty regularly. And if you're on all the social media pages, you also see this question come through where a LL is not able to get their supervisor to sign off on their paperwork for whatever reason. Maybe they've left their job, maybe their supervisor got moved or got fired, or there's a lot of reasons, right? But we don't have a process right now. What happens if you've been working with somebody for a couple of years and that relationship ends and they're unwilling, or the agency is not willing to provide that documentation to that social worker or that future social worker that verifies that those hours have happened? It creates a real conundrum for the individual who is limited license. And as a supervisor, you should, in theory, be talking about if there are serious concerns that are coming up through somebody's practice, that those should be worked through over those months or years that you're working with somebody. And if there is a serious conflict, or you think somebody's not ethically ready to practice, if there is unethical behavior, we have reporting mechanisms at the state level, both for the supervisor or the supervisee, if there's unethical issues going on. And it is important that really bad unethical behavior gets reported. Then it's up to the state of Michigan to ultimately review and look at all that. Yes, Kathy, or the supervisor passes away. Absolutely, that happens. And then what if there's no documentation that happens? And because we have no requirements in Michigan that says, hey, you should have a contract with your supervisor, or you should be having regular log that you're having folks sign off of. We, as an organization, have that as part of our supervisor training, our core supervision, partially because we don't have any requirements at the state. We've built in some things, but that since it's not mandated, there's a lot of people that fall out and don't have access to that and don't know what they should be thinking about as a new social worker. The other piece, as it relates to dual relationship, I got a call last week from a new social work grad whose wife owns a private practice and wants to work there after graduation, and wondered if it was okay to have her do their supervision. No. I mean, sometimes there's an easier answer to some of these ethical situations that come through our office, but we get dual relationship supervision questions pretty regularly. I have a friend, I have a family member, I have somebody who lives with me. It gets complex if you're maybe in a very rural area. Michigan does have some flexibility about who can provide supervision if you can't find somebody with your licensing designation in your area. But part of the reason we have our database is because we have had this issue for a decade, since really licensing has come into full force. And then the last thing that Jordan kind of touched on is because we don't have any training or teeth behind our supervision requirements, it's virtually impossible to verify competency in supervisors now. Because all we're requiring is people have a license. We don't require that people have gone through 1 minute of training in supervision. And we know that there are microaggressions and macroaggressions that show up in supervision from supervisors and from supervisees that people don't know how to deal with. There are real practice issues. Sometimes things get put to a really high level where we have seen social workers get charged or had to go to court to fight off felony potential things because of bad information given from their supervisor at their organizations, and maybe a child has passed away in their that was under their custody as a worker. And so supervision really is a critical function in how we build up the next generation of workforce. I think as we continue to have this discussion, we want to make sure that if we put recommendations forward, that we're not adding additional really financial burdens on our current workforce. I mean, that's been our huge conversation with the licensing reform, is how do we remove unnecessary barriers and costs to our current licensing process while trying to make sure we are as solidified and as ethically based as we can as a profession. So really good conversation so far. Thanks, Jordan.
Yeah. Briefly kind of coming off of that, we want to just kind of review briefly the current licensure requirements, right? I know, a lot of you guys, I recognize your faces or your names because you guys have been staying on top of, our hopes for licensure, but currently we have our background check, all the necessary paperwork, right? You complete 4,000 hours of supervised work by a fully licensed social worker, right? If you're going for your macro license, they need to be macro. If you're going for micro, they need to be micro. And then once you finish your supervision, which this is relatively new in the last couple of years, I know when I was getting licensed, this wasn't the case, but you can't take the ASWB exam until you finish all your supervision hours. So just kind of briefly, I think for those of us who've only lived and trained in Michigan, it can feel kind of wild to imagine any type of training requirement for supervisors. I mean, not when we're talking about how important it is and all of that, but when you really think about it and you think, well, why would we do that? I was certainly one of those people who, once I started looking, there are a lot of states who require some type of supervision training to be a supervisor, right? We could spend a whole hour kind of digging into all of these, and we don't have time for that, but just Ohio, right? 9 hours of initial training before you can be a supervisor. We've got folks who, IT on the map means initial training. So, Alabama, you have to have some type of initial training. And then every 2 years, when you renew your license in Alabama, you have to have 3 CEUs that are specifically relevant to supervision. Florida, just some type of training, right? Like it can be as simple as that or as extensive, like 30 hours of training in Minnesota. Like that feels like maybe a lot. Oregon, 15 hours of training and then 6 hours of CEUs every 5 years, right? Like and I think like Dwayne kind of already said, like, right, like where do we want to fall? We certainly don't want to make it harder for to talk and have my cat move. We don't want to make it harder for folks to become supervisors, right? Like we don't want it to be this additional burden that people are like, well, goodness, I do not have time or money or whatever. But we have to balance that with the real need for good, competent supervision as we move forward. Okay, so the supervisor survey. I hope that you guys all were able to do it if you were interested in contributing to it back when it was going around in, gosh, like April and May. This first slide, a lot of our folks who've come to the working conditions group may have already seen, but these were kind of our basic demographics, right? So we had 233 responses to the survey. We sent the survey out to all of our core supervision graduates, right? So everybody who's done the NASW core supervision training. We shared it on social media. We shared it at our conference. Surely there's more people providing supervision than the people who did our survey, right? So I just want to acknowledge that, right? Like the survey is only as good as how many folks we were able to reach. And I think that there is a little bit of a bias because a lot of the folks who completed it were the core supervision attendees, right? So those are folks who have done training for supervision, but largely white women. I think for some of us, the age variety was surprising to me, I guess. Not horribly surprising, but I think it's showing more younger social workers than I maybe expected were doing a lot of supervision. And then this one, what areas of social work? So this was a question that folks were able to answer more than one answer to, which, I think, so that doesn't surprise us, right? We got more responses to it than we would have. So a lot of private practice, a lot of mental health, administration, supervision, right? Those are folks who maybe are macro or who are providing supervision as part of their private practice or their stream of income, health, medical, school social work. Oops. There we go. And then this question on if folks charge and how much they charge. So a large piece of the pie is I'm paid through my employer. This is part of my salary, right? So I'm thinking of supervisors, fully licensed social workers that work at health systems, schools, like it is part of their job to provide licensure supervision to the limited license social workers who are working at their agency. But then a chunk of folks, 37 answers or 16%, provide supervision and don't charge. Then otherwise it's pretty evenly split up between, 26 to $50, 51 to 75, 75 to 100. I don't know if this is a time, maybe either save a comment for the end or put it in the chat, but if this is surprising to anybody, I bring a little bit of a bias because I did the supervision training, and it's about what it was recommended back when I did my supervision training. I don't know if you have any other comments on this one, Dwayne. And then also, again, the folks who did our survey were core supervision folks, right? A lot of them. So, but 94% of supervisors who took our survey had some type of certification or training. Like, I think that's telling, right? I think that shows that even if it's not required in Michigan right now, our supervisors take this job seriously, right? Like they are, going out of their way, whether, I mean, I know that when I took it, I was working for Trinity and they paid for it, but people care. People want to make sure that they're providing good supervision. And then this one, so for everybody who took the survey, they know that there was an open-ended question, something along the lines of, okay, what are we missing? Do you have any other recommendations or anything else you want us to know as we consider ultimately making recommendations for supervision training requirements? And from all those open-ended answers, I did my clinical social worker best to loop them into themes and to pull out some of the most common buckets of advice or recommendation. So 26 participants all had some comment related to, yes, we need more training requirements. They were supportive of this. Again, maybe we have a little bit of a bias sample with folks who, invested in their supervision education as core trainers, but still, I think that's I thought that was a good sign that we had so much support of that. Around 12 folks mentioned in some way that in their experience as supervisors, they felt like limited license social workers needed to have a better understanding coming into their careers as to the importance of supervision and what appropriate expectations were. It sounds like A lot of times they're thinking that they're going to spend their supervision studying for the ASWB exam. That was mentioned a few times. And so, this one I think has kind of two pieces for me. On the one hand, um, if we do provide any recommendations for requirements, right? Making sure that supervisors are prepared to give their LLs maybe right at the beginning of supervision some expectation setting, right? This is what this is what this isn't. But also potentially the schools, right? I mean, I remember learning a lot about what supervision was and what it was, and that wasn't just in school, that was in my internship too, right? Like I said, like I still think about those mentors that I had. And so I love this feedback and thinking about like how to make that actionable, because I think that any opportunity for us to prepare the new social workers for what they need to be successful is good. And then a similar amount of folks talked about difficulty connecting with limited license social workers who need supervision. So they talked about this balance between like making it affordable and like charging enough for their time, so I think that that's ongoing, right? Like I know that if you're a course supervisor, you can be part of the directory. I think that that's awesome. That's a great way for people to connect with trained, good, competent social workers as much as we can know, right? But yeah, this like balance of like, you are a fully licensed social worker, especially if you've invested in training, right? You can't offer it for free, can you? I don't know, question mark. Like it's one of those, like, I don't know if gray areas is the right way to describe it. It's just we have to balance, because we also, you know, we have an exam that's overpriced, that people are failing, that people have to take over and over again. We know that the jobs are lower paying as LLs. Like there's so many stressors and pressures in this part of a career. But that was acknowledged. And then a lot of people mentioned what they get from being a supervisor, that they enjoy the opportunity to work with new social workers, to build their confidence and help them develop their sense of self-worth. And I think that the like the flip side of that last one on like, how do we make enough money doing it and all that stuff, is like, it is about more than the money. I that's cliche and annoying, but it is true. I know I can speak for myself. Like I have gotten a lot out of providing supervision too. So it's all part of, the experience. And then a couple other common themes that came up a little less frequently, but I think are important to note. There was multiple acknowledgments of like macro specific supervision resources and training. I think just in general, a lot of, social workers are clinical, but a lot of us are macro too. And we always need to remember that. I think that all of our social work skills are transferable, but as we're getting into master's specialties, the macro folks need just as much time and attention as clinical folks. Even though we were talking about supervision, many supervisors are good advocates, and we're mentioning the issues with the ASWB exam and the hard position to be in when you work with somebody for 4,000 hours and then they can't pass the exam. And then acknowledging, affordability of a training if a training becomes a requirement, which we kind of touched on that. Ta-da! So I wanted about 15 minutes left, and I'm right at 12:45. Some questions that kind of come to my mind, but we certainly don't have to stick to these questions if you have other thoughts, but curious if there are surprises for you in the data that I mentioned, anything you agree with, disagree with, and like, what are we missing, right? Is there something that wasn't mentioned today that you feel like should be? And then just, I'm going to go to the next one real quick. Acknowledgement that I'm always around. Feel free to email me, reach out if you ever have thoughts or want to talk about this more. And keep coming to our meeting once a month. This fourth Thursday from 12 to 1, we have a subcommittee on supervision, and I think our next steps really are going to be starting to take all of this and come up with a good recommendation, and we'd love for you to be a part of it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And then, yeah, we will have any feedback that anybody wants to share.
Thanks, Jordan. I'll bring Ken's question first because we put that one on hold.
Yeah.
So first question, and sorry if my internet seems unstable. So if I go off of video, that's why. But the question that came through was, what ramifications are there for supervisors who give out erroneous information to those that they supervise? That's a really good and challenging question, Ken. Somewhat,
Yeah.
it's going to depend on, is it ever reported? And what sort of erroneous information. So a lot of times supervisees don't know what they don't know, right? And so they're relying on their supervisor to provide correct and ethical information. And if it comes to the attention of a supervisee that their supervisor is giving correct information, we highly recommend that any social worker call us. We have ethics consultations that are available for free. Our ethics committee is made up of 11 amazing Michigan social workers that provide free consultation to folks who need it here in Michigan. Our national office also does ethics consultations a couple of days a week. But if you think that there is an ethical violation that is serious enough that can't be resolved internally through either communication with one-on-one or organizationally, then that should be reported to the state. And reporting goes directly through the MyPlus system. So the new online portal that we use for licensing is where all of those go through. And then it's really on Laura to review and initially look at the cases. And then if it is deemed substantial enough for disciplinary review, that then goes to the Board of Social Work. And those are 9 individuals appointed by the governor. 6 social workers, 3 public members. And of that 9 members, there's a disciplinary subcommittee that's usually 3 individuals who make all of the final decisions of those disciplinary actions. So it takes a while generally for that process to go from somebody reporting to a disciplinary sanction potentially being implemented on somebody. And Jordan has also been doing some research on that, and we're waiting on some researchers out of Western Michigan have been doing a larger review of all of the health professions, ethical violations, and to see if there's kind of any standouts amongst the health folks.
I will say, I have been reading the actual, like, the violations that are reported and then what happens. And there are clear parts of our like health code that say, like, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do that, but there's not really clear, if you do this, this is your consequence. So I thought for sure I would see a lot more like supervisors being, coming up for ethical things. And I think I'd have to go look. I think I read 2 or 3 of the like 5 years that I've been through so far, instances of like a supervisor did something bad with their supervisee or whatever, or gave bad advice or whatever, and then got in trouble. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen, of course, we know that. But, and of those 3, their consequences were all different, right? So it's often some type of a fine, potentially a suspended license, potentially continuing education, often like you got to do 5 additional hours of whatever. But there's not like a lot of rhyme or reason. And I mean, we're certainly not done with our research there. But that shocked me. Like, you'd think for sure there'd be almost like I don't know, like a cheat guide of, like you get a ticket for missing a red light, or running through a red light, it's probably all going to be the same fee. But that doesn't seem to be the case with the board. So I hope between the two of me and Dwayne rambling, we answered your question. Where should we go? What else? Where should we I was not watching the chat, so I don't
Yeah,
know.
there's a couple of themes in here. So there's a couple of comments around like training requirements, both for supervisors and for LLs. So uh, V Ginny just had mentioned, I wish there was some minimal requirements for CEs for LLs. This is the time that they need education and learning most, and to form the habit of making space and times for CEUs. One of the things that wasn't necessarily part of this conversation specifically on supervision, but I think this is a great comment around agency culture, and professional development should be built into all of our workspaces. Whether that is day one limited licensees or interns to seasoned professionals, there should be opportunities for growth and leadership. So limited licensees have to take implicit bias and human trafficking. Those ones are mandated, not CEs, but the training requirement to at least apply for the limited license. But outside of that, it could take somebody, if they're going continually after they graduate, 7 years of that initial limited license to get to the full license level. If somebody's going 7 years without any additional education, absolutely problematic, right? And that's where I think also as supervisors, how do we check in with our folks about what additional learning opportunities do you need? Or here's a conference that I see coming up. I'd like to take you with me. Or let's see if we can get your organization to pay for that cost. Or this is an additional credential that may benefit you. You know, a lot of our folks are also getting CAADCs or school social work certificates or whatever it might be. Those are great opportunities in supervision to bring in educational opportunities because it's not mandated at the state level yet. I think in terms of what we end up deciding on for supervisors, it's a really challenging one, like Jordan mentioned, because we don't want to go in and require a bunch of additional things that's going to be really time intensive or financially intensive for our folks who just don't have it. So how do we enhance the agency support in those arenas as well as we're talking about it? There's a few questions related to ASWB and the exam stuff. I did drop a couple of links. I don't want to go too down that rabbit hole because that's not this call, but the pass rates are terrible. And if you look at the PDF that I dropped in, I will just 2023 was the first year of data that was available after Michigan was forced to wait to people had to finish all of their hours to take the exam. So 2023 was the first year that data was available for that included those people. Our pass rate for our clinical examination, which is about 95% of our test takers in Michigan. So that's a little bit, we're a different beast than a lot of other states in that that is our big chunk of people. We've got a small group of bachelors, we have a small group of masters, macro people, but most of our folks who are in our state are clinical. We had a overall pass rate in 2023 of 36.1% for our clinical exam. Let me just repeat that, 36.1%. If that should not be getting our entire profession like outraged about, there's clearly some problem with this test. Supervision has a conversation, absolutely, but there's also some huge systemic issues with this examination that the organization who puts on this examination refuses to acknowledge or do anything about. I did also drop into the chat. This summer, the National NSW Board put out a new statement, which also put some specific asks to ASWB as the exam writing entity on how to support, how we organizationally think that they can support current test takers or work with their current exam to make it a more equitable process for people to pass. I will say with the 2023 data, it's not broken down into any demographics. So we know that our older test takers, our English as a second language test takers, and our Black test takers specifically do much worse. So when you think of the 36%, that's probably even a much lower passing score for those categories of social workers. And we need a diverse workforce here in Michigan, and if we're bleeding certain demographics of social workers, we really need to do some hard work in finding alternative pathways in there. So I don't want to go too much down that rabbit hole, but I did want to just know that there's a lot of work being done on this. We are working on alternative pathways. We're looking at creating a Michigan specific exam that you would take as you exit your social work program. There's lots of things from there. Jordan, want to take the next section?
Yeah, I was reading through here. I know, like you said, there was a lot of comments about the ASWB exam. It's so hard. Like I can see my soapbox over there, but I'm not gonna get on it. Um, there was a conversation in here, kind of acknowledging that it's a really hard position to be in as the LL. If, you know, something is going wrong to report your supervisor. You're worried about them signing off on hours. We have a limited amount of time as limited license folks, right? You don't want to have to start over um, if you're, if you're you make your supervisor mad or whatever. I mean, I hate to know that that is probably a somewhat common power dynamic that's going on. I think that that goes back to, though, maybe the importance of a training, right? Or a requirement, because I think what at least one of the main tenets of the core supervision training when I did it years ago was finding that appropriate supervisor, right? Like finding the right fit. And not to sound too overly positive, but I think when you have the right fit, you can have a conversation when something's not going well. And maybe it's, hey, maybe we're not the right fit anymore. I'll sign your paperwork now for the hours we did together and then pass you off to somebody else or, whatever. Um, Versus potentially approaching a supervisor with feedback and then thinking that they're going to retaliate. So I don't know what the answer is or how we support in those situations. I mean, I hope that if they were to call our our ethics line, they'd get support, but I'm not super familiar with that process. So Dwayne, I don't know if you have other.
Yeah, I did drop the link to the uh National Ethics Committee. It was, I think, in one of the questions further up in the chat, but I'll also drop our state ethics. It's just our full committee list, but you'll see on there there's a online way to submit an ethics question, or you can just call the office here at NASW Michigan, and we have an ethics line. So when you just go through the repository of people to talk to, there'll be an ethics option, and somebody will get back with you usually within 2 business days at the most.
Yeah, good, good. Somebody asked about if a student intern would be able to get a certificate for today. I also don't know the answer to that question.
Yep, I did drop the eval chat in
Okay.
a link in the chat. I'll do that again now too. So please feel
So
free to
anybody who
start
does.
doing that once we wrap up here in just a couple of minutes. I
Okay.
saw a couple of really good resources in here, people creating internal study groups for their
Okay.
team. Absolutely, right? The exam has got to be an all of the above approach, because really, and I'm sure if we did a poll, how many like formal tests or quiz did you have during your MSW program? It'd be very minimal or zero, and
Yeah.
that's just not part of our training, right? And so part of the question around the social work exam is, why is that our method that we're evaluating ourselves by if that's not how we are trained in our academic program? Is that the best way and the only way that would work to make sure that we've got qualified people? And part of what Jordan is looking at specifically is, I would guess some of the folks on this call were grandparented into licensing in 2005 that didn't take this examination, that are probably really ethical practitioners that don't have ethical violations. And we know about 10,000 of our 30,000 licensed professionals in Michigan were grandparented in without this one particular exam as a requirement. And they don't have any more or less ethical violations than we've seen from folks in the 20 years since this requirement has been in place. But we do know that there's thousands of people not in our profession in Michigan because of this one particular issue. And supervision also ties into that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I know we're right at time, so I guess my only like last kind of um thing to say would be, I think we are going to be skipping our meeting next month just because summer is busy and crazy, but the September meeting would fall on the 25th, so it's always the fourth Thursday of the month from 12 to 1. And if this is like, if you have more to say and you want to be involved, join us, because typically in this meeting we break into subcommittees and we have this conversation just in a smaller little group. And we'd love to have you guys, everybody, join. Any last comments or thoughts? Or Does that feel, yeah?
Compared to other professions, like with test taking, like, I mean, has that been looked at? Because this can't be a social work, discipline only issue.
Yeah. So, I'm glad you mentioned that because I don't know, a couple months ago, time is weird, so maybe it was last year, but I was like, well, what is, our like counselors and doctors and lawyers and all these people, like, what are their test pass rates? And, it's a hard time for me to compliment ASWB, but a lot of our colleagues, their exams don't report pass rates. Like I was having a really, really hard time finding them. Um, I think I could find like the state of Florida did a report one year independently of their like, you know, um, whatever test or stuff like that. But um I don't want to say that. I don't want to give them too much credit for that, but I think we anecdotally know that standardized tests are the problem more than any one test. I think it's kind of groundbreaking that social workers are starting to say like this is not the way to to measure competency. Um, but I don't know if Dwayne has a better answer
Yeah,
for
I
that.
mean,
But
from the limited data that exists, there are disparities across almost all standardized testing, right? That's why most schools no longer require the ACT or the SAT to get into college anymore, right? We know that there's a lot of barriers for people at that level. Um, we do have our data now, which is important to have that publicly available to look at. There are slight differences in schools, but that also we know that schools have different resources sometimes for their students or alumni. And part of the reason we pushed back from the supervision requirement having to be completed before people could sit for the exam is we know anybody who's taken the ASWB exam, including myself, like it's not based off of what you do in practice. It's based off of theoretical concepts and some of it is what you learn in school, right? And so the closer you are to school, some of that theory is going to be more in your brain than it might be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years out of graduation. Plus, you may not have taken a standardized test in 20 years, right? And so it's getting in that mindset. And that really can't be placed on supervisors to know how to train a supervisee on how to sit for a standardized test. That's just not what supervision in theory should be used for. Jennifer, I see your hand.
I was just going to say, so medical students start from the beginning. That's how they're trained on how to pass the test. They get tested every so many weeks doing it that way. And then I know for my friends who have done the bar exam, they get hired at a place and they get 3 months usually paid at a place simply to get their bar exam stuff done.
Yeah,
And
how
so
professions have structured their exams within their fields is very different. And even regulatory, like counselors in Michigan don't need to do any continuing education, right? And so it's very different. We have 45 hours of CEs and they're really the outlier in that regards. And so supervision wise, Michigan has 4,000 hours of supervision. We're like the highest state in the bucket of the highest states that require supervision. Most states are 3,000 or less hours of supervision. So it really is pretty variable across not just the state, but nationally on what we're doing and then what our related professions are doing. Tomorrow we have a behavioral health coalition meeting across all the other behavioral health professions and we're talking about some of these things as well. And yeah, so Ruth, like their schools are offering some courses, are starting to incorporate some things better into the classroom. But I want to go back to, is testing the way to really understand competency, this particular type of testing? And I don't think it is, but I think that's the thing we're grappling with at the national level right now. But I appreciate everybody being on. Jordan, thank you so much for your expertise
yeah.
and you're willing to pull this together.
Yeah, of course. Thanks everybody who participated in the survey and hopefully we'll see a lot of you in a couple months when we meet again.